Most conditioning does not look dangerous, it looks normal. That is why it is powerful, because the deepest forms of conditioning are usually invisible to the people inside them. Habits become identity, repetition becomes truth, and systems become reality simply because they have existed for a long time. But awareness begins the moment you pause long enough to ask, why do I think this way? Why do I react this way? Who taught me this? Because many of the things people defend most strongly were never consciously examined in the first place. They were absorbed, repeated, inherited, and eventually accepted as just the way life is. Now let's move into the first insight. Most people are trained to seek approval before they seek understanding. From a very early age, people learn that acceptance often comes from fitting in, saying the right thing, behaving the right way, thinking the correct thoughts inside their environment. And over time, this creates a subtle fear of standing outside the group, not because people are weak, but because human beings naturally want connection. The problem begins when belonging becomes more important than truth. For example, a person may silence their genuine thoughts in order to avoid judgment. They may laugh at things they do not find funny, agree with ideas they never fully questioned, or pursue goals they never deeply wanted, simply because those goals are rewarded socially. And after enough repetition, they may forget the difference between what they truly feel and what they learn to perform for acceptance. This is how conditioning often works, not through force, but through reward. Approval becomes reinforcement, and reinforcement shapes behavior. Then behavior slowly shapes identity, until eventually the performance feels real. But awareness begins when you start noticing moments where your actions do not fully match your inner experience. Moments where you feel divided inside, where part of you wants authenticity, but another part wants approval. And that tension is important because it means awareness is beginning to wake up. Not rebellion, not anger, just observation, the quiet realization that much of human behavior is shaped by invisible social pressure. And once you can observe that pressure clearly, you are no longer completely controlled by it. You begin to step back from automatic behavior. You begin to question what truly matters to you. And in that space, something honest begins to emerge. And from there, we continue deeper into the next insight. This is where you begin to notice how deeply fear influences human behavior. Not always obvious fear, not dramatic fear, but subtle fear. The fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of being left behind, the fear of not being enough. And when fear operates quietly in the background of the mind, people become easier to influence without realizing it, because fear narrows perception. It pushes attention towards safety, approval, certainty, and control. For example, a person may stay in a life that feels deeply unaligned with who they truly are, not because they want to, but because uncertainty feels frightening. They may continue following paths that make them unhappy, simply because those paths feel socially accepted. A career, a lifestyle, a version of success. And even if something inside them feels empty, they continue moving forward, because stopping would force them to question everything they were taught to value. This is how conditioning maintains itself. Not always through pressure from outside, but through fear inside the mind. Fear keeps old patterns alive. Fear keeps people moving automatically. Fear keeps people too distracted to deeply observe their own lives. And modern culture often amplifies this fear without people noticing. Constant comparison, constant urgency, constant pressure to achieve more, become more, consume more, as if peace only exists somewhere in the future. And because the mind becomes trapped chasing the next thing, many people never fully arrive in the present moment. They spend their entire life preparing to live without truly living. But awareness begins when you stop running long enough to observe the fear itself, not escaping it, not suppressing it, just seeing it clearly. Because once fear is observed directly, it begins to lose some of its unconscious power. You begin to realize that many decisions in your life were not made from clarity, but from conditioning mixed with fear. And this realization can feel uncomfortable at first, but it is also freeing, because if fear helped shape the pattern, awareness can begin to dissolve it. And from this awareness, a different kind of intelligence begins to emerge, one that is no longer reacting automatically, but actually observing life clearly for the first time. This is where you begin to notice how distraction keeps the mind disconnected from itself. Most people rarely spend time alone with their own awareness anymore. The moment silence appears, something quickly fills it. Music, scrolling, videos, notifications, constant stimulation. And over time, the mind becomes uncomfortable with stillness itself. Not because stillness is dangerous, but because stillness reveals what distraction was covering. For example, a person may spend an entire day surrounded by input. The phone is checked constantly. Attention moves from one thing to another. Every quiet moment is immediately filled, and by the end of the day, they feel mentally exhausted. Yet the moment they are finally alone in silence, they reach for more stimulation again, not because they truly need it, but because the mind has become conditioned to avoid emptiness, to avoid stillness, to avoid direct observation of itself. And this creates a cycle. The more distracted the mind becomes, the harder it is to remain present, the harder it is to think clearly, the harder it becomes to even know what you genuinely feel beneath all the noise. Because constant stimulation weakens attention, and weakened attention creates a fragmented mind, a mind that is always moving, but rarely seeing clearly. Awareness begins when you notice how uncomfortable silence has become, not judging yourself for it, just observing it honestly. Can you sit quietly without reaching for stimulation? Can you simply observe your thoughts without immediately escaping into distraction? For many people, this feels surprisingly difficult, and that difficulty itself reveals how conditioned attention has become. But something important happens when you begin allowing silence back into your life. At first, the mind may feel restless, thoughts may become louder, emotions may surface more clearly, but if you remain present without escaping, the mind slowly begins to settle, like muddy water left untouched long enough to become clear again. And in that clarity, you begin hearing something deeper than noise, your own awareness. Most people believe they already know who they are, but if you observe carefully, much of identity is built from repetition, memory, and external feedback. Labels collected over time. You are smart, you are difficult, you are successful, you are not enough. And slowly, these labels begin to shape self-perception, not because they are absolute truth, but because the mind keeps repeating them. For example, a person may experience failure early in life, and without realizing it, that experience becomes part of identity. Not just I failed once, but I am someone who fails. And once the mind accepts a label like that, it starts filtering reality through it. New experiences are interpreted through old conditioning. Possibilities are unconsciously limited, and behavior begins matching the identity the person believes they are. This is how mental conditioning becomes deeply personal, because eventually people stop questioning the story, they defend it, even when the story causes suffering, even when it no longer reflects reality. The mind clings to familiar identity, because familiarity feels safe, even painful familiarity. But awareness begins when you start noticing the difference between who you are and the story you repeatedly tell yourself about who you are. That distinction changes everything, because stories can change, labels can dissolve, patterns can be observed, and what can be observed is no longer fully controlling you. For example, someone who spent years believing they were not confident may suddenly notice moments where confidence naturally appears. Small moments, subtle moments, but enough to reveal something important. The identity was never completely fixed. It was conditioned, reinforced, repeated. And once this becomes visible, the mind begins to loosen its grip on old definitions, not through force, not through pretending to be someone else, but through awareness, the quiet realization that you are far more than the labels you inherited. Now let's go deeper into this, because this is where you begin to notice how modern culture constantly trains the mind to chase more success, more status, more attention, more productivity, more consumption. And because this pursuit never truly ends, many people spend their entire lives moving forward without ever feeling fulfilled. For example, a person reaches a goal they once believed would finally make them happy. A new job, more money, recognition, a better lifestyle. And for a brief moment, there is excitement, relief, validation. But soon after, the mind creates another target, another thing to achieve, another thing to pursue, and the cycle begins again, because the system is not designed around contentment. It is designed around endless movement, endless desire, endless comparison. And when people become deeply identified with this cycle, they slowly lose connection with the present moment. Life becomes a constant psychological future. I'll finally feel peace when I'll finally feel complete after. But the future keeps moving, and peace keeps getting postponed. Awareness begins when you start questioning whether constant chasing is actually bringing clarity or simply keeping the mind occupied, not rejecting ambition, not rejecting growth, but observing the difference between meaningful action and unconscious pursuit. Because there is a difference between creating from clarity and constantly running from inner emptiness, and many people never notice this distinction. They remain busy their entire lives without ever asking why they are moving so fast. But when you slow down enough to observe this clearly, something unexpected happens. You begin to see that fulfillment was never hiding in the next achievement. It was hidden underneath the constant mental movement itself, underneath the endless search, underneath the idea that you must become something else before you can feel whole. And in that realization, the mind begins to soften, the pressure begins to loosen, and for the first time, you may begin experiencing moments that are not built around chasing. Moments where simply being present feels enough. You start to wake up to the matrix and family karmic systems when you begin to notice how emotional reactions are conditioned long before you become aware of them. You inherited them. Most people believe they are simply reacting naturally to life, but if you observe carefully, many reactions are automatic patterns learned through repetition. Certain words trigger emotion instantly. Certain situations create anxiety immediately. Certain types of people activate old responses inside the nervous system. And most of this happens before conscious awareness even enters the picture. For example, someone receives a small criticism. The words themselves may not be severe, but almost instantly, the body tightens, defensiveness appears, emotion rises, and the mind begins building a story around what happened, not because the present moment is necessarily dangerous, but because old conditioning has been activated, past experiences, old emotional memory, learned patterns of protection, and once these patterns repeat enough times, they begin to feel like personality. This is just how I am. But awareness begins when you slow down enough to observe the reaction before becoming completely lost inside it. You begin noticing that between the event and the emotional response, there is a brief space, a small moment of awareness. And in that moment, something important becomes possible. Observation without immediate identification. You start seeing the reaction as a process happening inside the mind and body rather than absolute truth. And this changes your relationship with emotion completely, because instead of instantly becoming the reaction, you begin witnessing it. You notice the tension, the story, the impulse, without automatically following all of it. And slowly, the old conditioning begins losing some of its power, not because you are suppressing emotion, but because you are finally becoming conscious of it. For many people, this is the beginning of real freedom, not freedom from emotion, but freedom from unconscious reaction. And once you experience this clearly, you begin realizing how much of human behavior operates automatically, how many conflicts begin from unconscious patterns, how many decisions come from emotional conditioning rather than clarity. And from this realization, a deeper intelligence begins to emerge, one based not on automatic reaction, but awareness itself. Just pausing for a day to reflect on your life is where everything begins to come together. Because once you start observing all of these patterns clearly, you begin realizing something profound. Most people are not actually experiencing reality directly. They are experiencing layers of conditioning placed over reality. Conditioned beliefs, conditioned fears, conditioned identities, conditioned desires, conditioned emotional reactions. And because these patterns are repeated constantly, they begin to feel normal. But normal does not always mean true. For example, many people spend years chasing approval without ever questioning why approval feels so necessary. Others spend years chasing success without ever asking who defined success for them in the first place. Some spend their entire lives trying to become accepted by systems that never truly understood them. And all of this creates a deep disconnection from the self, not because people are weak, but because they were never taught to observe the conditioning itself. They were taught to participate in it, to continue it, to identify with it. But awareness changes everything, because the moment you begin observing the system, instead of unconsciously reacting inside it, you begin stepping outside of it psychologically, not by escaping society, not by rejecting the world, but by seeing clearly. And clear seeing changes the entire experience of life. You begin noticing when fear is shaping thought. You begin noticing when comparison is distorting perception. You begin noticing when distraction is pulling you away from yourself. You begin noticing when old conditioning is speaking through your reactions. And in that awareness, something powerful begins to happen. You stop being completely controlled by unconscious patterns. For the first time, there is space between you and the programming. And in that space, real choice begins to appear. Not automatic behavior, not inherited identity, not unconscious repetition, but conscious awareness. And maybe this is what true freedom actually is. Not freedom from responsibility, not freedom from life, but freedom from unconscious living, freedom from moving through reality completely asleep inside inherited patterns. Because once awareness begins, you can never fully return to unconsciousness in the same way again. You start seeing through things more clearly, through distraction, through emotional manipulation, through social pressure, through the endless chase for validation and identity. And slowly, you begin reconnecting with something deeper underneath all of it. Presence, clarity, awareness itself. And now as we close this video, take a moment to simply observe your own mind quietly, not to judge it, not to fight it, just to see it clearly. Because seeing clearly may be the beginning of stepping out of the mental matrix entirely. And if this video helped you in any way, consider liking and subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel continue creating content like this, and explore the other videos on this channel for more reflections on awareness, conditioning, perception, and reclaiming your mind from unconscious patterns. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.